An immigration officer jammed a pen into a CIA commander's neck without warning. Seconds later, the entire airport lit up in flames as revenge exploded into chaos. He struck a decorated CIA commander with a pen, thinking no one would ever fight back inside an airport. Subscribe if you believe no badge is above the law. Commander Rail Donovan didn't flinch when the cold end of a steel detector buzzed inches from his shoulder. He kept his arms loose at his sides and his eyes forward, narrowing slightly under the flickering fluorescent lights of Anderson International Terminal. The checkpoint line behind him groaned with the usual tension of early flights, people tapping passports against palms, luggage wheels bumping, the faint rustle of boarding passes. But none of it touched the focus in Donovan's gaze. The real tension wasn't in the air, it was in the eyes of the uniformed officers up ahead. "Next," came the sharp voice from the front of the line. Donovan stepped forward with steady, calculated strides. His leather boots thudded softly against the polished tile, the scuff marks on the floor catching dull reflections of the morning light bleeding through high windows. His jacket, a worn, dark brown leather that carried the scent of rain and dust, shifted with each movement, hiding the faint outline of the credentials pressed flat against his chest. At the inspection desk stood Officer Jareth Clines. He didn't smile. He didn't even nod. He just extended one gloved hand and said, "Papers." The word hung in the air like a veiled threat. Donovan reached into his jacket and handed over the documents with the quiet confidence of a man who had crossed borders that didn't exist on any civilian map. His expression remained unreadable, but beneath the surface, his mind began to calculate. Cline's fingers gripped the folder a little too tightly. His posture, rigid, aggressive, didn't match the relaxed efficiency of a standard officer. Donovan watched as Clines opened the folder slowly, eyes scanning the lines with deliberate exaggeration. "Commander Rail Donovan," he muttered under his breath as if tasting the name. "Assigned to Strategic Logistics, Foreign Division." "Yes," Donovan replied simply. His voice was calm but clipped. "My arrival was cleared 3 days ago. Priority escort clearance." Cline's lips curled upward, but it wasn't a smile, it was a smirk. "I'm aware," Clines said. "I've read your file." That was the first red flag. Donovan tilted his head slightly, just enough to watch Cline's movements without appearing confrontational. The officer's eyes didn't track the page naturally. Instead, they darted toward the 2 guards positioned at either end of the checkpoint hall. Both were watching too closely. Not protocol, anticipation. "I'm not here long," Donovan added, choosing his words with caution, meeting a contact and departing within the hour. Clines said nothing. Instead, he placed the folder down and picked up a pen. No clipboard, no form. Just a pen. He tapped it once against the desk before slowly unscrewing the cap. To most, the motion would have seemed mundane. To Donovan, it was deliberate. His training kicked in, the micro-twitch in Cline's wrist, the way his right foot slid half an inch back, grounding for leverage. Donovan didn't move, but he noticed. "I've seen men try to hide things behind uniforms," Clines said, voice just above a whisper. "But not everyone is who they claim to be." Donovan held the man's gaze now. "Are you accusing me of something?" Clines' smile vanished. Not yet. Around them, the airport noise continued. Luggage thuds, the squeal of children, the call for Flight of 22 boarding gate 9, but between Donovan and Clines, the silence thickened. Clines twirled the pen once in his fingers and leaned closer across the desk. "You've got a lot of stamps in here. Ankara, Volanai, Crichton. Funny, most people don't come back from those places." Donovan didn't answer. The pen now rested between Cline's fingers like a dagger waiting for justification. "What's your mission here, really?" Clines asked, louder this time. His voice carried, drawing a few glances from nearby officers and passengers. Donovan exhaled slowly, his body still. "I've given you all you need. If there's a problem, escalate it to your supervisor." "Already did," Clines replied. "He's the one who told me to keep you right here." The second red flag unfurled. Clines wasn't acting on instinct. He was following instructions. Donovan's mind raced. Someone had tipped them off. But tipped them off to what? His operation was sanctioned, encrypted, off-book. Only 2 men knew he was here, both trusted. So who fed Clines this story? Clines signaled again with his eyes, just a flick, to the guard by the metal door. The man stepped forward casually, hand resting on his hip, where a compact baton gleamed beneath the edge of his vest. "You might be a decorated name on paper," Klein said, voice lower now, intimate, taunting. "But that paper doesn't tell me what you're hiding under that jacket." Donovan's jaw tightened. He glanced downward for 1 second at the pen. It was standard issue, matte black, but its clip was angled like a pry bar. Modified. Not military, but personal. The kind of weapon a man built himself, not something handed out. That made it more dangerous. Klein's didn't blink. "Step over here." Secondary screening. "Not happening," Donovan replied, firm. "I wasn't asking," Klein snapped. The officer's tone triggered a shift in the room. One of the guards unsnapped the holster on his hip. Another passenger backed away from the line, sensing something off. Donovan raised both hands, slowly, palms open. Not in surrender, but warning. "You're escalating a situation without cause." "I'm following orders," Klein shot back, stepping around the counter. From his peripheral vision, Donovan caught another subtle movement. Klein's palming the pen with a reverse grip as he closed the distance. His left hand shot toward Donovan's shoulder. That was when the comm snapped. In one smooth pivot, Donovan shifted his weight and grabbed Klein's wrist mid-motion, his thumb pressing into the tendons just below the joint. But he was half a second too late. The pen came down in a blur of motion, its sharpened tip catching flesh just below the collarbone. Agony exploded in Donovan's side. A gasp ripped through the crowd. The terminal went silent. Blood bloomed down Donovan's chest, hot and fast. He stumbled back against the desk, one hand pressing into the wound as the other reached instinctively for the edge of the counter for support. Klein stood above him, breathing hard, eyes wild, not from fear, but triumph. "He's a traitor," Klein shouted, turning to the crowd. "He's armed and dangerous." "Step back." Donovan's vision blurred around the edges as pain burned through him like acid. Officers rushed forward, weapons drawn, forming a perimeter. And in that instant, Donovan understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an execution plan in uniform. Someone had turned the airport into a trap, and the trigger had been pulled by a bureaucrat with a pen. The calm, before the storm, never announced itself loudly. It lingered in silence, waiting to be broken. Klein's asked for his documents. The words left his mouth as calmly as any routine greeting, but his eyes betrayed him. Cold, narrowed, and unblinking, they fixed on Donovan with the kind of quiet hostility that couldn't be mistaken. There was no hospitality in them, only judgment, suspicion, and something else simmering just beneath the surface. Donovan, used to scanning expressions the way others read maps, caught it instantly. Still, he offered no reaction. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim leather folder, and handed over his credentials with steady fingers. Kleins took them, his hand brushing Donovan's slightly, intentional or not. The pressure lingered too long. Then he looked down, feigning focus, flipping open the identification with exaggerated care. The laminated badge glinted under the overhead lights. Commander Rael Donovan. It read clearly in bold font above a digital insignia. Kleins tilted the badge toward the light, as though testing it for authenticity, while his other hand drifted across the desk and tapped a sleek black pen that lay beside the keyboard. To the casual observer, it was nothing more than an immigration officer doing his due diligence. But Donovan wasn't a casual observer. His pulse ticked higher by a beat. He tracked the movement with sharp eyes, taking in the subtle flick of Klein's fingers, 2 quick taps, then a glide over the pen, and finally a slow push of the credentials back toward Donovan, though not enough to return them. Just a gesture. Behind Donovan, passengers shifted, impatient and tired. The terminal buzzed with background noise, announcements over the PA system, the low rumble of suitcase wheels, the tired cries of a toddler far down the line. But all of it seemed to fade behind the tension that quietly crackled between the two men. Donovan tilted his head slightly. "Is there a problem with the documentation?" he asked, keeping his tone level, disarming. His voice was deep but calm, like gravel under soft boots. Kleins didn't look up. "Just being thorough," he replied, voice flat. "You know how it is." But Donovan didn't know, not like this. Not with the way Klein's left hand hovered an inch above the desk, thumb grazing the side of that pen. There was no logical reason for Klein's to delay. The credentials were clean, and the file had cleared customs digitally before Donovan ever stepped off the jetway. He was on no watch lists. No alerts should have been triggered, unless someone had rewritten the data. Donovan's eyes drifted past Klein's to the left. A pair of officers stood near the wall of glass overlooking the arrivals terminal. Their postures were too alert, two angled toward him. One of them subtly adjusted the strap of his radio. The other tapped his boot twice again, likely nothing to an untrained eye. But Donovan had been taught to watch for signals even in silence. These men were waiting for something, or for someone's signal, and that someone was sitting just feet away holding his credentials hostage with one hand and toying with a pen in the other. Donovan tried to keep his breath steady. He could feel the air tighten around him like the edges of a net closing in. Every fiber of his training warned him now. This wasn't an inspection. It was a maneuver, the kind you couldn't walk away from with pleasantries. Clines finally looked up, meeting Donovan's gaze directly. His smile was faint, a twitch more than an expression. "Quite the resume," he said, tilting the ID slightly. "Commander, Black Ops background, overseas files. You've been in some very interesting places." Donovan said nothing. Clines leaned closer over the counter, his tone dropping into something more private. "Some people think men like you are dangerous. That you operate above oversight?" Still calm. Still silent. But Donovan's left hand drifted slightly back toward his belt. Not to draw attention, just enough to ready himself. Then came the flashback, sharp and vivid. A memory etched into his training days. His old mentor, Commander Tyrone Wex, leaning across a cluttered strategy table lit only by one hanging bulb. "You'll prepare for blades, bullets, and bombs," Wex had said. "But remember, it's the small things that'll catch you off guard. The pen in the right hand is deadlier than a blade in the wrong one." Donovan blinked it away. His focus returned to Clines. The pen moved again. A quiet slide beneath Clines' palm. He twirled it once, then tapped it against the desk. A slow, rhythmic motion. Not nervous, not idle. Intentional. Measured. Something clicked. Donovan noticed the keyboard had been bypassed. Clines hadn't entered any data, he was stalling. Buying time. And those officers in the corner? Still watching. One of them adjusted his earpiece. He shifted his weight ever so slightly, just enough to ease the tension in his knees. If something happened, he'd need to be fast. Pain wouldn't be the first thing to hit. Instinct would. "You're not from around here, are you?" Clines asked, tapping the pen against the laminate again. "I go where I'm assigned," Donovan answered, the steel in his voice barely contained. "You should know that." Clines nodded slowly. Then, with one final glance at the badge, he pushed it forward. But just before letting go, he said it. Softly, almost like a whisper. "I know what you are." The words were chilling in their ambiguity. Was it a threat? A confirmation? Or just a final note before chaos? Donovan didn't respond. He just met the stare. Clines released the badge, but his hand stayed curled around the pen. A breath passed. Then two. The officers near the window took a step forward. Donovan's heartbeat thumped once in his ears. And then Clines moved his hand again, closer to the pen, fingers tightening. That was all Donovan needed. His instincts shouted through every nerve. This was not routine. This was not oversight. This was not an inspection. This was a setup, a noose, and the tightening had just begun. What looked like routine protocol was, in truth, the tightening of a noose. Without warning, Clines lunged. The fluorescent light above glared cold and indifferent as his arm shot forward, hand wrapped tightly around the base of a regulation black pen. Ordinary to any bystander, but in that moment, more deadly than a blade. His other hand clamped onto Donovan's shoulder with brute force, yanking the taller man slightly forward as the pen plunged with sickening precision into the side of his neck. A grotesque sound followed, a sharp, wet pop as metal tore through skin and muscle. Rail Donovan's body jerked violently. His eyes widened in shock, pupils dilating as pain surged like fire through his veins. The world tilted. The terminal, with its sterile design and wandering passengers, twisted into a blurred nightmare. A cry escaped from someone behind the security rope. Others gasped. One suitcase rolled off an unattended cart and thudded to the floor, but no one looked down. All eyes were on Donovan, the man now clutching his neck, his fingers slick with his own blood. The warm fluid pulsed between his knuckles, soaking the collar of his leather jacket in deep crimson. He staggered backward a step. The polished tile beneath him, just seconds ago pristine, now shimmered with his lifeblood. Clines stood firm, arm extended, still gripping the pen like a weapon of justice. "Traitor!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the steel beams and glass. "This man is a spy. He's not who you think he is." The air seemed to stop moving. A single moment stretched, heavy and motionless, as if time was holding its breath. Then chaos exploded. Passengers screamed. Some dove behind benches, clutching luggage or children. Others raised their phones instinctively, recording the scene with trembling hands. Alarms blared overhead, their shrill shrieks merging with shouted orders from distant corners of the terminal. Red lights strobed across glass and chrome, painting the scene in alternating pulses of emergency. But in the eye of it all stood Donovan, bleeding, silent, and calculating. His thoughts were sluggish at first, fogged by pain. Then, sharper than before. He was trained for gunfire, trained for sabotage, for bombs. But a pen? An office pen shoved into his throat by a uniformed officer? That he hadn't prepared for. And yet, somehow, it made perfect sense. His mentor's voice echoed through his fading consciousness. The smallest tool in the wrong hands can be deadlier than a blade. Donovan's knees nearly buckled as he reached up and tore the pen free with a guttural groan. The metal was still warm, its tip bent. Blood streamed faster and his vision swam, but the pain grounded him. It gave him purpose. He pressed his palm over the wound, grimacing, then slid back a step behind a kiosk, chest heaving. His breath came in ragged pulls. His fingers trembled as they looped his belt from his waist, using one hand to tie it high around his neck like a makeshift tourniquet. Clines didn't hesitate. "Stop him!" the officer barked, pointing toward Donovan. "Don't let him escape. He's armed. He's dangerous." But the only weapon Donovan had held was the very pen now lying bloodied at his feet. Two additional officers, young, twitchy, stepped forward, unsure. Their hands hovered over their batons, waiting for some invisible signal to justify violence. Donovan locked eyes with them. Their hesitation gave him a sliver of time, not enough to escape, but enough to see. One of the men, standing slightly behind Clines, bore an expression that didn't match the panic. He wasn't afraid. He was smiling. Subtle, but unmistakable. His lips curled in satisfaction as though watching something unfold exactly as planned. This wasn't an act of panic. It wasn't a rogue officer losing control. This was coordinated. Donovan scanned the scene faster now. He knew he didn't have much time. The buzzing lights, the closing crowd, the security railings behind him. Every detail mattered. Every surface could be used. Then came the second wave. A blast of fire alarms triggered automatically. Someone had pulled the manual switch. In the far distance, beyond Gate 7, thick gray smoke began to rise from the baggage area. The scent of burning plastic crept through the air. Sirens from the far end of the terminal began wailing. Screams intensified. Passengers scattered now, some trampling over luggage, others abandoning carts mid-movement. Someone cried out for security. A mother pulled her child behind a vending machine. A businessman with a red tie dropped to the floor and crawled beneath the check-in desk. Donovan knew this script. It was a staged diversion. Fires in the rear gates, a stabbing in the checkpoint, all timed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an ambush. Gritting his teeth, Donovan dropped low and flipped the nearest kiosk on its side. The heavy metal frame crashed down, creating a crude shield. He ducked behind it, yanking a service tray to block the left flank. His fingers were slick with blood, his vision still blurring, but his instincts never left him. His objective had changed. No longer was he here to extract intelligence. No longer was his mission to blend and vanish. Now, he had only 3 goals. Survive, identify the architect behind this betrayal, and expose the truth. Across the terminal, Clines stepped forward, holding up the bloodied pen like a trophy. "He was smuggling information to foreign enemies," Clines shouted again, eyes scanning the crowd. "He attacked me when I tried to stop him." More lies. And yet the cameras, dozens of them, recording, captured only moments of action, not the truth behind them. Donovan's jaw tightened. "Cowards hide behind procedure," he muttered under his breath, tying off his belt with a final tug. The room shimmered with chaos, but beneath it Donovan could feel the pattern. Who had given Clines the order? Why now? Who would benefit from painting a decorated commander as a traitor? He ducked low, dragging himself toward the corridor marked "Authorized Personnel Only." He would find out. He had to. And if someone had lit this match, then they were about to learn just how much fire he could bring. Behind him, the blood trail was not just a wound, it was a warning. The battlefield had changed, and it had a new objective now. When the first drop fell, the entire airport became a battlefield disguised as a terminal. The pen came out with a wet, sickening sound. Donovan's hand clenched around it, the tip slick with his own blood, as pain pulsed in jagged waves through his neck. The world tilted for a moment, his knees buckled, vision blurred, but years of discipline pulled him back from the edge. He stumbled backward, sucking in a ragged breath, one hand already moving to unbuckle his belt. Around him, chaos bloomed like a wound torn open. Shrieks erupted from behind as a nearby woman dropped her carry-on and fled, her voice swallowed by the rising storm of confusion. The security barrier buzzed, red lights flashing now, and the metal detector screamed an endless alarm. People surged away from the checkpoint, ducking behind walls and benches, unsure who the threat was. Some eyes turned to Donovan in terror. Others stared at Klein's, still gripping the bloody pen like it was a weapon of glory. Donovan fell against the base of a kiosk, ripping the belt free and pressing it against his neck with practiced precision. The makeshift tourniquet pinched hard, but he welcomed the pain. It told him he was still upright. He pressed his back to the cool metal, steadying his breath. His eyes darted to the ceiling, catching a mirrored panel above the customs hall. In it, he saw something he wasn't meant to see. An officer, smirking. It wasn't Klein's. This one stood near the hallway entrance, half-shadowed, hands casually on his hips as if the entire ordeal was a planned spectacle. His face wasn't shocked. He wasn't rushing to aid Klein's or detain Donovan. He was waiting. Donovan's pulse slowed, not from blood loss, but from focus. He understood now. This wasn't a rash act by an overzealous officer. This was a trap, and he had walked into it with eyes wide open, believing in routine, believing in protocol. That belief had nearly cost him his life. "You're going to bleed out, traitor," Klein's roared over the terminal noise, thrusting the pen skyward like a dagger raised in victory. His voice cracked slightly, rage or adrenaline or maybe uncertainty, but it carried across the room. Donovan's eyes didn't leave the smirking officer's reflection. Somewhere overhead, the fire alarm began to blare. Strobes painted the polished floor in harsh white and red flashes, echoing off walls lined with glass and steel. Sirens overlapped each other like discordant music. A baby cried nearby. A suitcase rolled unattended into a wall. And amidst it all, Donovan knew the time for quiet calculations was gone. He moved. Rolling to his side, he upended the kiosk, sending pamphlets and tourism brochures scattering across the floor. The steel frame gave him partial cover. Not ideal, but better than nothing. He pressed a shoulder into it, breathing hard through clenched teeth. The tourniquet slowed the blood flow, but not the dizziness. His fingers trembled, more from blood loss than fear. Across the room, Klein's motioned to two officers near the side gate. Their hands moved to their batons, eyes watching Donovan's every shift. Not helping passengers, not restoring calm, just waiting for the order to move in. Donovan scanned for exits, calculating angles, memorizing positions like a chessboard. His mind returned to a lesson drilled into him in training. In confusion, the one who adapts first wins. Behind him, a shrill metallic clang echoed from the baggage gates, a sharp, unnatural sound. Not an accident, not a dropped tool. It repeated, deliberate, measured. Donovan's ears twitched toward it, instincts awakening like a storm gathering strength. A signal. That sound didn't belong to panic. It belonged to planning. The weight of it settled into his gut. This wasn't an isolated act of violence born from mistaken identity. This was a stage, and he was the actor marked for execution. He forced himself to speak quietly under his breath, as if grounding his own reality. This isn't about a lie. It's about an erasure. From behind the barrier, one of the officers edged forward, weapon unholstered now. Not a baton, but a firearm. Not standard airport procedure. Not for someone like Donovan, whose identification had cleared him for high-priority diplomatic movement. Klein's barked again. "Commander Rail Donovan is a traitor to the state. Stand back. Let us do our duty." The passengers, confused, trembling, obeyed the authority of the uniform. Some ducked, some ran. A few stayed frozen, phones held high, recording, watching, but not helping. Donovan didn't blame them. He reached inside his coat, feeling the inner pocket. The drive was still there, the package he'd come to retrieve, encrypted and hidden inside a false compartment. It wasn't just a mission anymore. That drive might be the reason someone wanted him silenced. A movement in his periphery yanked his attention left. Another officer slipped between benches, not toward Klein's or toward him, but toward the hallway leading to internal security. That officer was not panicking. He was positioning. He was part of it. Donovan grit his teeth, pushed his boot against the tile, and prepared to move. His body screamed from the wound, but his mind had already shifted into survival mode. No backup, no radio, no orders, just instincts. He counted their footsteps. 1, 2, 3. The clanging noise near the baggage gate stopped. A moment later, the sprinklers activated overhead, dousing the air in icy water. It didn't put out fire, it only added another layer of confusion. Mist blurred vision, drenched hair and uniforms alike. Clines wiped his eyes and cursed under his breath. Donovan moved. He slipped from cover to the side pillar, dragging his weight behind him, eyes locked on the smirking officer now distracted by the sprinkler deluge. The blood from his neck pulsed, but slower now. Manageable. For the moment. Passengers screamed again as another officer unholstered his weapon. Donovan's hand brushed a luggage cart, using it to pull himself forward toward the checkpoint's blind corner. He would not die in this terminal. He would find the source. He would expose the lie. He would turn their trap into a reckoning. And somewhere in the distance, behind the cries, gunmetal, and firelight, he heard the metallic clang return. Rhythmic now, almost like a countdown. Tick, tick, tick. The pen had drawn first blood, but fire was waiting to consume everything in its path. Donovan stumbled forward, barely catching himself as his blood smeared across the polished airport floor in jagged, frantic streaks. The fluorescent lights above flickered like an omen, casting dizzying reflections on the tile beneath him. Behind him, gasps and screams sliced through the terminal as passengers scattered in every direction. Some ducked behind benches, shielding their children. Others stood frozen, eyes wide, phones raised, capturing chaos with trembling hands. Officer Jareth Clines stood at the checkpoint, his chest heaving, his hand still slick with Donovan's blood. He raised the pen high, holding it like a weapon of justice, the tip glinting red under the light. "This man is an infiltrator," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of adrenaline and twisted conviction. "He's a threat to national security." The words echoed across the terminal, bouncing off walls and swallowing reason. Passengers, too panicked to judge truth from madness, began pushing past one another, desperate to escape whatever they believed was coming. Donovan's vision blurred, his head pounding, but his instincts kept him moving. The wound at his neck pulsed with each heartbeat, warm blood leaking steadily down his collar. Every breath came sharp, every step a struggle. Yet his mind remained alert, assessing, calculating. Clines wasn't alone. 2 officers flanked the main security gate, hands resting firmly on their batons, eyes tracking Donovan's every move. Their postures were tense, not defensive, but expectant. They weren't reacting to a rogue attack. They were waiting. For a signal. For him to fall. Donovan's boots slid slightly on the blood-slick tiles, and he pressed a hand to his neck, applying pressure as best he could. He angled himself toward the nearest barrier, head low, movements controlled despite the pain screaming through his body. Then he saw him. Among the sea of horrified faces was a man who looked out of place, not in clothing or appearance, but in demeanor. While everyone else wore panic, this man remained calm, seated on a bench with a duffel bag resting between his feet. He didn't flinch at the alarms or the screams. His eyes locked on Donovan's, and in one smooth, deliberate motion, he tapped his wrist twice. A flash of memory hit Donovan like a jolt, an old field signal used during off-grid missions. Recognition snapped into place. This man was no civilian. He was an operative. Donovan didn't know whether to feel relief or suspicion, but the message was clear. He wasn't entirely alone. Before he could move toward the man, the terminal was pierced by the sharp wail of the fire alarm. Red lights stuttered to life, painting the glass walls and chrome fixtures in crimson pulses. The scent of smoke drifted through the air, sharp, acrid, real. It came from the direction of the luggage bay. Someone had triggered an explosive. The air shifted. Panic exploded like a second wave. A mother shrieked and pulled her child beneath a vending machine. An elderly man dropped to his knees, hands over his ears. People screamed over each other as the crowd surged and fractured, desperate to find exits that now seemed far too narrow. Donovan turned toward the source of the smoke. His mind raced through possibilities. A fire in the luggage bay could only mean one thing. This wasn't a spontaneous attack. It was coordinated. Planned. Timed. Clines shouted something behind him, but the words were lost in the sirens and the rush of feet. The 2 officers at the gate stepped forward, batons drawn. Donovan tensed, ready to bolt, then froze again. The man with the duffel bag was gone. Not fled. Gone. Donovan's eyes darted, scanning the benches, the floor, the corners, but the man had vanished like a ghost. Either he had blended into the crowd, or he had moved into position. Either way, it confirmed Donovan's suspicion. This wasn't about stopping a rogue agent. It was an ambush, disguised as protocol, staged on one of the busiest terminals in the country. And he was the target. One of the officers rushed him. Donovan ducked low, pain flaring in his shoulder, and slammed his elbow into the man's ribs. The baton clattered across the floor. The second officer moved in, but Donovan used the first as a shield, shoving him into his partner and sprinting past them toward a kiosk. His knees nearly buckled, but momentum kept him upright. He ducked behind the kiosk, panting, heart pounding so hard it rattled his teeth. The screams of the crowd faded into the background. His mind narrowed into clarity. This was no longer about a secure handoff, no longer about a clean exit. He was in a war zone now, and someone had written his name in the middle of the battlefield. A burst of static rang from the terminal's PA system, then silence. The lights flickered again, and the smoke grew heavier, the fire alarms failing to drown out the rising dread in the air. Every siren, every footstep, every breath felt sharpened. Donovan tightened his grip on the metal frame of the kiosk, bracing for what would come next. He didn't yet know who had ordered the strike or why Kleins believed the lie he'd been fed, but he knew one thing with certainty. They wanted him erased, and they had turned an airport into a trap to make it happen. He exhaled, steadying himself, blood still dripping from his jaw onto the marble below. The airport was no longer a hub of travel, it was a trap dressed in glass and steel. Cale Drummond stood up without urgency, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if he had been waiting for this moment to arrive. He wore a dark gray tactical jacket, weathered and faded, and slung over one shoulder was a duffel bag that had seen years of dirt, desert, and gunfire. His eyes met Donovan's, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition collided with disbelief. "Cale," Donovan rasped, blood trickling from the side of his neck. His vision blurred at the edges. Cale's expression didn't flicker. He moved with purpose, snatching Donovan by the arm and dragging him behind a row of kiosks as the terminal descended into madness. People screamed, alarms wailed, and thick, acrid smoke began curling from the luggage bay where the fire had started. "Stay still," Cale muttered, already ripping open the duffel. "Hold pressure here." He shoved a packet of gauze into Donovan's hand, then pulled another and pressed it against the ragged wound himself. "You're supposed to be dead," Donovan said through clenched teeth, flinching as the cloth touched raw muscle. "They told me you burned in that cobble raid." Cale's hands didn't stop moving. "They wanted you to think that," he said coldly. "Same people who sent Kleins after you." The words landed with weight. Donovan blinked against the blood in his eyes, forcing clarity back into his mind. The fire was spreading. A burst of heat exploded as the cart ignited, sending glass shrapnel spinning through the air. Metal detectors shrieked, and overhead lights flickered as backup systems faltered. Across the hall, Kleins had regrouped. His once rigid composure was unraveling, replaced with manic energy. He pointed in Donovan's direction, shouting over the chaos. "He's not who he says he is. He's a traitor, armed and dangerous." More officers took position behind Kleins, drawing weapons, real ones now, not standard-issue batons. The rules had changed. Donovan grunted as Cale yanked his belt off and used it to tighten the gauze around his neck. "They're painting you as the villain," Cale said. "The intel came from inside the bureau." "You're marked for erasure." "Why?" Donovan asked, pain pushing through his voice like broken glass. "Why now?" Cale hesitated. "Because you're the last name on the list. You're the only one left who could expose what Stroud's been building." A chill stabbed deeper than the bleeding. Valen Stroud, the bureau director who had toasted Donovan's promotion, who called him a national asset. If he was behind this. The kiosk beside them shattered as a bullet pierced its metal frame. Cale spun around, shielding Donovan as more rounds slammed into the displays, sending sparks flying. A glass case exploded overhead, showering them in shards. Civilians screamed and ran in every direction, some ducking behind benches, others sprinting toward locked gates. The fire alarm joined the cacophony, adding shrill chaos to the already boiling tension. "We can't stay here," Cale snapped, handing Donovan a compact tactical knife. "I can't get you out of the building, but I can get you underground." We'll regroup and find out how far this goes. Donovan nodded, his fingers wrapping around the hilt with familiar muscle memory. I need to know how many are in on it. You don't want to know, Cale replied, guiding him along the side of the wall. Not yet. As they moved, Donovan's blood left a trail, crimson footprints against polished airport tiles. His legs threatened to give way, but his will held. The pain was secondary now. What consumed him was the realization that Klein's wasn't the architect, just the first visible brick in a wall built by traitors. A sudden burst of static came through the terminal PA system, followed by Klein's voice, sharp and unrelenting. All units converge on Sector 3. I want Commander Donovan detained immediately. Use lethal force if necessary. Cale muttered, They've declared open season. A second explosion rocked the terminal from the direction of the confiscated goods room. Flames licked toward the ceiling, smoke pouring into the ventilation. Emergency lights blinked red. Chaos was no longer spreading. It was being weaponized. Donovan stumbled as they neared a side service hallway, barely visible behind a vending machine. Cale kicked it aside and punched a code into a hidden panel. The door clicked and creaked open, revealing darkness within. Down here, Cale said. Maintenance tunnels. They lead to the lower cargo lifts. As they slipped through the door, a bullet slammed into the metal frame beside Donovan's head. Cale shoved him forward, slamming the door shut just as more shots followed. They descended quickly, breath ragged, footsteps echoing off concrete walls slick with condensation. The terminal above was a roaring storm of fire, gunfire, and manipulated authority. But here, in the shadows, Donovan had one ally and a blade. They paused at the landing, catching their breath. Cale glanced at him. You okay to move? No, Donovan said, tightening his grip on the knife. But we move anyway. In the distance, smoke alarms continued their shrill cry, and through vents the scent of burning plastic drifted in. The airport was unraveling, and Donovan knew the web reached farther than the gates. Blood was no longer the only stain. Now fire spread like a signature written by unseen hands. With smoke curling upward, the ceiling-mounted sprinklers activated in a sudden hiss, casting down a relentless sheet of cold water over the terminal. Lights flickered as alarms continued to scream, and the sharp scent of burning electronics mixed with the metallic tang of blood already soaking through Donovan's shirt. The tiled floor shimmered beneath the storm of panic, now slick with water, smoke, and chaos. Commander Rail Donovan ducked low, gripping Cale Drummond by the arm and dragging him across the soaked tiles toward a nearby service corridor. A spray of bullets shredded the air behind them, slamming into kiosks and tearing posters from the walls. No more rubber rounds, this was live fire. Donovan's ears rang with every impact, the thudding echo of real death chasing them with each second. Someone had upgraded Klein's squad with battlefield-grade weapons. That alone confirmed it. This wasn't a manhunt. It was an execution. Cale stumbled as they reached the steel corridor door, nearly collapsing. They're not just trying to arrest you, he gasped, coughing through the smoke. They're here to erase you. Donovan slammed the door behind them and twisted the latch, though it wouldn't hold for long. The corridor was dim, the fluorescent tubes above flickering between dull white and buzzing dark. Their footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete as they moved deeper into the underbelly of the airport. Who gave the green light? Donovan asked, voice tight. The adrenaline dulled the searing pain in his neck, but only just. Cale didn't answer right away. He checked his duffel, producing a small pistol and passing it to Donovan. Stroud's Inner Circle, Bureau of National Security. They've been whispering you're compromised for months. Said you were too close to foreign intel. Too independent. Donovan clenched the pistol in one hand and steadied himself against the wall with the other. They fed Klein's the lie and told him to make it public. On camera, in front of witnesses. Make it real, Cale nodded grimly. And then stage your neutralization during the chaos. Tie it all up with a clean headline. Above them, through thin ceiling grates, the terminal still erupted in confusion. Footsteps pounded, more gunshots echoed, and panicked voices bounced off the walls. Donovan listened, parsing the soundscape. Footfalls, radio chatter, not panicked, hunting, methodical. They're flanking the corridor entrances, Donovan murmured, boxing us in. From behind, a metal door slammed open with a loud clang. Donovan didn't hesitate. He spun and unleashed the fire extinguisher he had snatched earlier, blasting a thick white cloud directly into the faces of two officers stepping into the hallway. They cursed and staggered backward, eyes and lungs overwhelmed. "Go!" Donovan barked. He and Kyle sprinted, boots slapping against the wet floor as more bullets pinged into the walls. Sparks flew where metal kissed metal. Cale led the way down a stairwell that spilled into a loading bay, half-lit, filled with the low hum of industrial fans and the mechanical grind of distant baggage systems. The noise masked their escape, but also made it harder to predict what waited in the dark. Donovan's breath came in sharp pulls. His fingers tingled from blood loss. His legs felt like stone. Yet his mind cut through the fog. He knew this rhythm. Pain didn't stop him. It clarified his focus. The wound at his neck burned, but the deeper wound was realization. This betrayal ran far beyond Klein's. This wasn't a rogue officer lashing out. This was the Bureau, the very house he had protected, now casting him as the traitor. A sudden voice broke through the static of a nearby security radio. Klein's. "Bring me the commander's head. I want him down now." The words struck like a hammer. Not arrest him, not secure him. A direct kill order. The tone was pure rage, but also something else. Fear. Desperation. Klein's had something to prove, to Stroud, to the Bureau, maybe to himself, and it meant he wouldn't stop until Donovan's body hit the ground. Cale ducked behind a large rolling crate, yanking Donovan into cover. "They're going to flood this level," he warned. "Thermals, drones, everything." "We go down," Donovan said, pointing toward a narrow maintenance hatch near the conveyor line. "Into the baggage tunnels. It's tight, but they'll be slower in there. Less visibility." Cale gave a nod and helped pry the panel open. The air that spilled out was stale and hot, thick with the scent of oil and exhaust. Donovan went first, his body scraping against the narrow opening. Every move ached, but he pushed forward. Behind him, Cale sealed the hatch just as more boots thundered above them. The darkness swallowed them whole. Only faint emergency lights guided their way now, pulsing in dim orange bursts along the length of the maintenance shaft. The hum of conveyor belts was constant, joined by the occasional thunk of luggage being rerouted by unseen hands. Down here they were rats in a steel maze. But for now, they were alive. Donovan allowed himself a moment to breathe, crouching beside a junction panel, his chest rising and falling like a man who had escaped drowning but still heard the ocean. The bullet wounds, the betrayal, the bloodied pen, the fire. Cale rested beside him, eyes watchful. "You okay?" Donovan didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, watching the water from the terminal still drip down in slow, rhythmic taps, painting dark spots on the concrete. Then he whispered, voice hollow but sharp. The predator's eyes had turned on him, but his teeth had not been dulled by blood loss. He thought humiliating and stabbing a man of power would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. A shockwave tore through the baggage tunnel as fire raced along a ruptured gas line, sending a wall of heat toward Rail Donovan and Cale Drummond. The blast rolled like thunder beneath the surface of the airport, shaking steel beams and illuminating the dark corridor in flashes of orange and red. Donovan flinched against the tremor, pressing his back to a pillar as sparks showered down from the overhead wiring. Debris clattered across the conveyor belts, and smoke snaked through the narrow ventilation ducts like ghostly fingers searching for breath. He gritted his teeth and tightened the makeshift tourniquet around his neck. The wound throbbed with every heartbeat, but there was no time to falter. The stench of burning plastic and scorched metal filled the air, mixing with the distant cries of panicked passengers echoing through the airport's ventilation shafts above. Kyle crouched beside him, his frame silhouetted by the flickering maintenance lights. He held out a combat knife, its blade dulled but solid. "Take it," Cale muttered. "You'll need it more than I do if they get close again." Donovan nodded, fingers trembling slightly as he took the blade. His skin was clammy, eyes glassy, but his focus sharpened. The moment Cale handed him the weapon, something inside him clicked into place. Not panic, not desperation, but resolve. "They know we're down here," Cale said, voice low, scanning the tunnel's branching corridors. "They've sealed the terminal entrances." All traffic rerouted. This place is a cage now. Donovan's jaw clenched. "Stroud wants a spectacle," he replied. "He could have hit me in the field. He wants me buried beneath headlines Cale didn't answer at first. Then, softly, 'You remember Corsham Base? The night they made us toast to unity?'" Donovan turned toward him slowly. Stroud led that toast. A silent beat passed between them, thick with understanding. That one name, Stroud, shifted the air around them. It was no longer about Klein's, no longer about rogue intel. It was about betrayal from the highest corridors of trust. Suddenly, boots pounded on metal above. A steel ladder clanged as shadows descended. Tactical flashlights swept across the tunnel entrance, beams cutting through the smoke like scythes. Officers barked orders, voices hard and clipped. They weren't police. They weren't security. They were trained, just like Donovan once trained them. Cale pulled him behind a row of stacked cargo bins. Donovan crouched low, pressing the knife handle to his thigh to keep it steady. "They're not here to arrest you," Cale said, breathing fast. "They're here to erase you." Donovan's pulse pounded in his ears. The pen that had opened his neck was only the opening move. What followed was an execution choreographed by bureaucrats in clean suits and polished shoes. "Tell me everything," he said, eyes narrowed. Cale nodded grimly. "Director Valen Stroud issued the internal bulletin 3 days ago. Said you'd gone dark. Said you were preparing to leak classified comms to foreign actors. No evidence. Just silence." Then orders to neutralize Donovan stared into the swirling tunnel fog. "He toasted my promotion. He sent flowers when my team came home from Darwin. He said I was the face of the new era." "Exactly," Cale replied. "And now you're the face he's trying to burn." Another explosion shook the tunnel entrance. This one smaller, maybe a flashbang, maybe sabotage to collapse an escape route. Officers fanned out, their footsteps growing closer. A red laser swept past Donovan's shoulder and struck the far wall. He grabbed Cale's shoulder and hissed, "We move now." Toward the east conveyors. "I know a hatch that leads near the service elevators. If we reach it—" A sudden voice cut through the smoke. "Rail Donovan." "You are under detainment for acts of treason against the Bureau of National Security. Surrender now or face lethal force." Donovan's breath caught. The voice was familiar, cold, controlled, but it wasn't Stroud. "That's Wexler," Donovan whispered. "He was in my unit." "They turned him too," Cale muttered. Donovan felt rage coil in his gut. His body may have been bleeding, but every cell screamed for justice. His fingers gripped the knife tighter as memories of training sessions with Wexler rushed back, how he'd taught the man to disarm, to adapt, to lead. Now those lessons would be used against him. Footsteps approached fast. Flashlights bounced against the metal walls. Donovan whispered, "On my signal. Use the carts as a shield. We get to the next platform and drop smoke. They'll follow our trail." Cale gave a nod, pulling a flare from his duffel and cracking it to life. A crimson glow lit the tunnel like spilled blood. Donovan counted down silently. 3, 2, 1. They bolted. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets shredding crates and suitcases. Luggage burst open, clothes flying like confetti in a hellish parade. Donovan tackled a conveyor belt, rolled over it, and landed hard on the other side. His vision swam, but he forced himself to his feet, dragging Kyle behind him. Smoke grenades hissed from Kyle's bag, masking their trail. Shouts echoed, officers blind in the haze. But the fire from earlier still raged nearby, casting flickering shadows that danced across their path like specters. Every footstep felt like running through memory, lessons, betrayals, alliances, and lies. Donovan didn't speak again until they reached a narrow alcove beside a power junction. He leaned against the wall, blood soaking into his collarbone. "If Stroud's at the top," he said between gasps, "then the entire Bureau may already be compromised." Cale didn't argue. A distant alarm wailed from above. More reinforcements were likely descending. But Donovan's mind had already shifted. Klein's was a pawn. Stroud the architect. The rest of the board still lay hidden in smoke and fire. And now Donovan wasn't running. He was hunting. The walls trembled, not with the weight of stone, but with the weight of betrayal coming to light. The control room door slammed open under the weight of Donovan's shoulder, and he and Cale tumbled inside. Bullets ricocheted off the metal frame, sparks flashing like miniature explosions before the door was shoved shut. Cale twisted the lock in place and spun around, pistol raised, his body taut with tension. Donovan staggered forward, the trail of his blood marking every step as he lurched toward the console. His breath was shallow, ragged, yet his mind remained fixed on the objective. Survival was no longer enough. He had to expose the truth before the Bureau buried him under their lies. The room was cramped, filled with humming machinery and the cold glow of monitors. Wires snaked across the floor, some scorched, others buzzing with stray current. Donovan tore open a panel with one hand, the other pressed firmly against the wound at his neck. His fingers, slick with blood, tapped frantically at the keyboard. The system lagged under emergency lockdown protocols, but Donovan's training made him relentless. He muttered through clenched teeth, "I need this feed live now." Cale kept his stance firm by the door, eyes locked on the dim corridor beyond. His knuckles whitened around the pistol grip, his expression a mask of controlled fury. The silence outside was deceptive. Every shadow threatened movement, every echo promised violence. "Make it fast," Cale urged, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Donovan didn't reply. He couldn't afford the luxury of words. The monitors flickered. First static, then the fractured feeds of terrified passengers running through smoke-filled terminals. Donovan's eyes narrowed as he bypassed command protocols. He leaned closer to the console camera, the red indicator light flaring to life. His voice, though strained, carried the weight of authority honed by years of command. "This is Commander Rael Donovan," he began, his tone steady despite the blood streaking down his collar. "I am not your enemy." The enemy hides behind uniforms and false orders. Above them, every screen across the airport lit with his battered face. Gate displays, baggage claim monitors, even the ticket kiosks, his image spread like wildfire. Passengers froze in place. Confusion rippled through the crowds. Some gasped aloud, others pointed at the screens, their fear slowly turning into doubt. A murmur grew louder with each passing second. "You've seen the fire. You've heard the gunshots," Donovan continued, eyes burning into the lens. "This chaos was never meant for you. It was meant for me. Ask yourselves, why would they turn your airport into a battlefield to silence one man?" Gasps echoed through the terminals. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men raised their phones to record, and questions began to ripple louder than the alarms. "If he's the traitor, why is he bleeding like prey?" someone shouted. Others demanded answers from the nearest officers, pressing forward with sudden courage born of uncertainty. Clean stood frozen near Gate 12, his hand wrapped around his service weapon. Donovan's blood still stained his uniform from the earlier strike, yet the words now unraveling across the screens hit him harder than any blow. His certainty fractured. He had shouted that Donovan was a traitor, but now doubt clawed at his mind. The officers beside him shifted uneasily as passengers stared not with fear, but with suspicion. "Sir," one of them whispered, "what if he's telling the truth?" Kleins swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between the crowd and the monitors. For the first time, his loyalty wavered. In the control room, Donovan sagged slightly, drained by the effort, his hands trembling as he steadied himself against the console. Cale turned sharply toward the hallway. A strange sound carried closer, the faint clicking of boots, deliberate and calm. The lock on the door shuddered once, twice. Then the entire wall shook as a concussive blast ripped the frame inward. Fire and smoke billowed through the entry, heat searing the air. From the haze stepped a figure clad in tactical black, his presence commanding silence even amid chaos. Donovan's bloodied eyes widened as recognition cut deeper than pain. Valen Stroud, director of the Bureau, walked into the flames with calculated calm, his weapon drawn and his expression carved from cold stone. The architect of betrayal had walked directly into the inferno he designed. Stroud's entrance was not subtle, it was theatrical. The double doors slammed open with a metallic clang, and smoke rolled in from the tunnel beyond like a curtain lifting for an actor's first scene. His tactical gear glistened under the firelight, polished plates catching the strobing sparks from damaged wiring. Every movement was deliberate, each step echoing with authority as though he had choreographed this reveal long before the first drop of blood had been spilled. Donovan, standing with one arm pressed to his wounded side, locked eyes with the man he had once toasted victories beside. In Stroud's gaze, there was no trace of the comrade he remembered, only the cold certainty of a man who had planned betrayal down to the smallest detail. "You should have died quietly," Stroud sneered, his voice smooth but venomous. He lifted a suppressed pistol, its matte black barrel steady as it leveled with Donovan's chest. The gesture was calm, clinical, as if Stroud were closing a ledger rather than aiming to end a life. Behind him, his squad filed into the room like shadows taking shape, masks on, rifles raised, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaos raging through the terminal above. Donovan's mind churned with bitter recognition. While passengers screamed and smoke-swallowed corridors, Stroud had dressed for war, prepared for this exact moment. The irony cut sharp. The world believed the night's terror was the work of chance, yet its architect now stood in full view. Cale shifted at Donovan's side, his scarred face twisted with fury. He raised his stolen pistol and stepped forward, shoulders squared, refusing to yield ground. "One move, and you'll bleed out here, Stroud," he warned, his voice gravelly but unwavering. The air thickened between them, the silence fragile as glass, broken only by the crackle of exposed wires. Stroud's eyes flicked toward him with a predator's disdain, yet he did not falter. His focus snapped back to Donovan, the weight of his betrayal pressing down like a steel vise. For a fleeting moment, Donovan's thoughts strayed to every meeting, every late-night debrief, every cheer of glasses in the bureau's halls. The foreshadowing was there all along, painted in the too perfect smiles and hollow praise. Now, under the firelight, the illusion dissolved, leaving only the raw truth. Stroud had never been an ally, only a man biding his time. Donovan's pulse hammered against his wound, each throb screaming that he was cornered, outnumbered, and bleeding. Yet surrender was not in his nature. He studied the room, eyes darting to the electrical panel sparking behind Stroud. Every calculation sharpened in his mind, a desperate plan forming where none seemed possible. Stroud's finger tightened on the trigger. The muzzle of the pistol glowed faintly in the fire's reflection, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Donovan refused to give him the satisfaction of fear. With a sudden surge, he seized the fire extinguisher at his feet and hurled it with all the force his battered body could muster. It struck the electrical panel, shattering gauges and tearing sparks into the air like a storm of meteors. The room plunged into half-darkness, the overhead lights sputtering and dying. Shadows stretched long, twisting the battlefield into a chaotic canvas where no man had clarity. Stroud's shot rang out in the confusion, the suppressed crack muffled yet vicious. Donovan felt it rip across his arm, tearing through flesh and igniting a line of searing pain. He staggered, the wound burning hot, but momentum drove him forward. With his other hand, he raised the combat knife Cale had given him in the tunnels and lunged into the veil of smoke and sparks. The blade found its target, slicing deep into Stroud's shoulder. Blood sprayed against the console, bright red mixing with the electric blue of sparking wires. Stroud grunted, his expression finally cracking into a grimace as he stumbled back, his pistol hand faltering for the first time. Chaos swallowed order. Shouts erupted from the squad, their beams of light cutting wildly through smoke. Cale opened fire, each shot controlled, forcing Stroud's men to scatter for cover. The smell of ozone, blood, and burning insulation filled the air, suffocating in its intensity. Donovan pressed forward despite the pain, eyes locked on Stroud as if the rest of the world no longer existed. His breath came in ragged gasps, his strength draining, yet his will surged higher. Betrayal had dragged him into fire, but vengeance would not let him fall. The true battle had finally stepped out from the shadows and into the fire. Gunfire thundered in the tunnels, each shot ricocheting like a storm trapped beneath the earth. Donovan pressed his back against the cold steel of a luggage cart, his breath ragged, his eyes darting between shadows that danced under the strobe of muzzle flashes. Kyle was beside him, firing in short, controlled bursts, his scarred face set in grim concentration. The air was thick with smoke, oil, and gunpowder, every breath tasting of fire and grit. The conveyor belts rattled on, oblivious to the carnage, carrying suitcases as though nothing had changed. To Donovan, those belts looked like rivers carrying ghosts, the lives of civilians still screaming in the terminal above, their fear now mirrored underground. He lunged forward, overturning the luggage cart and using it as a moving shield. Bullets punched holes into its metal surface, sparks flashing where steel met lead. Donovan's wound throbbed with every step, but his focus had narrowed to a single burning line. Find Stroud, end Stroud. Nothing else mattered. Cale's voice carried above the chaos, raw with urgency. "Left flank rail, 2 coming down." Donovan spun, knife flashing in his hand, slamming the blade into the nearest assailant's side while Cale dropped the second with a shot to the chest. The men fell hard, their radios still crackling with clipped orders. The echoes of authority were everywhere, a reminder that Stroud's grip still held fast. Through the smoke, Donovan caught sight of Klein's. The officer's figure emerged from the opposite corridor, gun raised, hands trembling. His eyes met Donovan's, but they were not filled with certainty. They wavered, cracked. Behind him, Stroud's command bellowed like thunder. "Fire! End this now." The order was sharp, unyielding. Donovan braced himself, ready to feel the impact of betrayal, but what followed was silence. Klein's weapon lowered, his jaw tight, his breath uneven. It was a refusal, quiet yet deafening in its defiance. Donovan's heart clenched. The man who had once driven a pen into his flesh now hesitated, torn between lies and truth. That hesitation was the first fracture in Stroud's wall. Stroud's fury erupted. His voice was venom, spitting across the tunnel. "You're weak, Kleins. Do it." But Kleins stayed still, his silence more powerful than any bullet. For Donovan, it was the moment the tide shifted. Rage surged through him, stronger than the pain. He burst forward, crashing into Stroud, tackling him hard against the steel wall. The impact echoed through the tunnel, metal vibrating like a drumbeat of war. Their fists collided in a blur of motion, Stroud's strikes fueled by arrogance, Donovan's by betrayal and survival. Every blow carried the weight of shattered trust. Every punch was a reckoning years in the making. Sparks lit the darkness as their struggle slammed them against a ruptured wire. The cables spit white fire, casting grotesque shadows across their faces. The smell of ozone filled the air, sharp and choking. Donovan gritted his teeth, forcing Stroud's pistol hand upward, the suppressed weapon firing harmlessly into the ceiling. "You should have stayed dead, Donovan," Stroud hissed, his breath hot with hatred. Donovan's only reply was a guttural roar as his knife drove into Stroud's shoulder. Blood sprayed across the steel, black in the flickering light, mixing with sparks that hissed and sizzled as they hit the ground. Then the world shifted. A hiss became a roar as leaking fuel pooled across the floor, ignited by the falling sparks. The fire leapt alive, racing down the tunnel in a chain of explosions. Crates burst into splinters, steel groaned, and the walls themselves seemed to shudder in agony. Donovan staggered back, half-dragged by Cale, his vision swimming in red and smoke. Behind them, Stroud screamed, his voice carrying above the roar of the inferno, before it was smothered by collapsing steel beams. Flames swallowed everything, the men, the weapons, the betrayal itself, until nothing but fire and judgment remained. The fire that consumed the tunnels was not chaos, it was judgment. Emerging from the tunnels, Donovan and Cale stumbled back into the main terminal, their silhouettes framed by smoke and flickering emergency lights. The once orderly space had become a stage of chaos, overturned luggage carts, shattered glass, and the shrill wail of alarms that refused to die down. The crowd gasped as the two men appeared, battered, bloodied, and yet unbroken. Dozens of phones shot upward, their cameras recording every twitch of Donovan's steps, every rivulet of crimson running down his collar. The lens of the world had found him, and there was no turning away from it now. Officers scattered through the terminal froze in hesitation. A moment earlier they had been certain of their orders, but now their command structure lay in ruins. The fall of Stroud echoed in every uncertain glance, every trembling hand that could not decide whether to raise a weapon or lower it. Cale steadied Donovan by the arm, his own face streaked with soot, his eyes darting across the hall for any sign of treachery. The atmosphere pulsed with tension, a limbo between violence and surrender. Jareth Klein stepped forward, pushing past a cluster of stunned officers. His hand, the same hand that had driven a pen into Donovan's flesh, still bore the dark stain of dried blood. The crowd murmured in recognition, their eyes moving from Donovan's wound to Klein's hand, a living reminder of the chaos that had begun. For a long heartbeat, it seemed the officer might strike again. His shoulders squared, his breath came sharp, and he raised his gaze to meet Donovan's. But something inside him faltered. The certainty that had driven his rage cracked beneath the weight of everything he had seen. The broadcast, the passengers' disbelief, the screams of men who had followed false orders. Slowly, with deliberate motion, Kleins lowered himself onto his knees. His voice shook as he admitted, "I was misled. I believed the lies." The words, barely louder than a whisper, carried across the silent terminal. Donovan, swaying on his feet, steadied himself against the nearest metal pillar. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, each inhale rattling against the tightness of his wound. Yet his voice, when it emerged, was clear and commanding, carried across the still-active loudspeakers of the airport. "You have seen the truth tonight," he declared, his tone rising above the sirens. The sound reverberated across the glass walls and echoed through the concourse. His eyes swept across passengers and officers alike, his bloodied figure illuminated by the cold emergency lights. Lies tried to bury me, but fire revealed what uniforms could not hide. The effect was immediate. A cheer erupted from the crowd, raw and uncoordinated at first, but swelling with each passing second. Some passengers wept openly, the adrenaline of terror bleeding into relief. Others raised their voices, chanting Donovan's name, clinging to the image of him as a savior rather than the villain they had been told to fear. Phones continued to record, every second broadcasted to the world beyond these walls, ensuring that no lie could undo the truth unveiled in blood and fire. The irony cut deep. Hours before, Donovan had stood accused, branded a traitor, hunted through halls of steel and glass. Now, with his body sagging from exhaustion and pain, he stood at the center of the terminal as a symbol of defiance, a living contradiction to the story woven against him. His vision blurred, the edges of the world swimming, but he forced himself to remain upright. He could not falter now, not before these witnesses. Cale's hand gripped Donovan's shoulder with quiet urgency. "You need help," he muttered, his voice thick with concern, though his eyes remained sharp, scanning for danger. Donovan's knees buckled slightly, and Cale caught him, holding him firm against the pull of gravity. To the crowd, it looked less like weakness and more like loyalty embodied. The image would last far longer than the moment itself. Kleins remained on his knees, head bowed, his shoulders trembling as if the weight of realization pressed down harder than any physical blow. Officers around him shifted uneasily, torn between shame and uncertainty. Some lowered their weapons completely, others kept their grips tight, unwilling to let go of orders ingrained into their bones. But the shift was undeniable. The authority of Stroud's command had crumbled, leaving only fractured obedience in its wake. Donovan swayed again, his vision flickering with dark spots. The terminal spun faintly, but Cale's voice anchored him. "This isn't the end," Cale whispered, his breath close to Donovan's ear, steady and grave. "It's the beginning of war." The words were not a warning, but a prophecy, a reminder that the rod extended far beyond Stroud. Donovan's lips pressed together in a grim acknowledgement, his silence saying more than words could. Foreshadowing weighed heavily in the air. Though Stroud had fallen, the Bureau itself was compromised, and every man in uniform might still be a piece on the wrong side of the board. Donovan knew it as clearly as he felt the blood dripping down his collar. Tonight was no conclusion, only an ignition. The cheers of the passengers, the tears of those who believed him now, would not shield them from the battles to come. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. His body screamed for rest, but his mind burned with a fire that no wound could extinguish. As Cale guided him toward safety, the commander's words lingered in the terminal, etched into memory and broadcast across every recording device. The truth had been revealed in fire and scars, and nothing could erase it. The victory was real, but its cost was a battlefield written in scars. Weeks later, Donovan sat in the hospital bed with the quiet hum of machinery filling the silence. The room was dim, its single lamp casting a pale circle of light across the floor. Bandages clung to his neck where the stitches ran in a crooked line, each one a harsh reminder of the pen that had nearly ended him. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee from the nurse's station down the hall. Donovan's body had begun to heal, but his mind carried scars that no surgeon could close. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the strike, felt the burn of betrayal, and heard the roar of fire as the tunnels collapsed. Kyle Drummond pushed open the door with his shoulder, carrying a chair in one hand and a file in the other. His scarred face was set in its usual calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of what he had seen. "You look better standing than lying, Rail," Cale said, pulling the chair beside the bed. Donovan managed a faint smirk. "Better is a word I wouldn't use." "Alive will have to do." The two men shared a silence thick with unspoken memory, smoke, screams, the sound of steel beams crashing into the tunnels. Cale leaned forward, setting the file on Donovan's lap. "The Bureau is trying to show its clean hands. Reforms, public statements, the usual performance." His voice hardened. "But you and I know Stroud was not the only one. Men like him don't act alone. He was a door. Behind him is a corridor full of shadows." Donovan's fingers brushed the file, but he didn't open it yet. His mind weighed the choice before him. Return to command, take orders as if nothing had happened, or vanish into the underground to dismantle the traitors one by one. The door creaked again, and Jareth Kleins entered quietly, his uniform stripped of insignia. His shoulders slumped, and his hands shook slightly as he carried a single envelope. He did not meet Donovan's eyes at first. "I was wrong," Kleins said, his voice hoarse. "They fed me lies, and I carried them like truth. I attacked you, believing I was saving this country." His words broke in the middle, but he forced them out. "I'm ready to testify. Stroud is dead, but the others, they must be exposed." Donovan studied him, the memory of the pen piercing his neck burning against the man's apology. For a moment, silence pressed heavy between them. Then Donovan said, "Your testimony will matter, Jareth, but don't mistake confession for redemption. It's a step, not salvation." Kleins bowed his head, setting the envelope on the table before leaving without another word. When the door closed, Donovan finally opened the file Cale had brought. Inside were names, dates, and coded communications, evidence of networks stretching deeper into the Bureau than he had imagined. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with grim resolve. The airport had been only the opening move. The real war would be fought in shadows where cameras could not see, where pens and papers carried more power than bullets. Outside his window, he could hear children playing in the hospital courtyard. Their laughter carried faintly through the glass, and one boy's voice rose above the rest. "Commander Donovan. He's the one who beat them." The name carried like legend in their game, innocent yet sharp with meaning. Donovan's heart tightened. He never asked to be a symbol, yet the world had made him one. Cale rose to leave, pausing at the door. "The choice is yours, Rael. Go back to command and wear the uniform, or disappear into the smoke and hunt them as only you can. Either way, you'll never walk free of this." Donovan nodded slowly, his eyes locked on the stitches in the mirror across the room. They weren't just wounds. They were marks of war, cruel signatures of betrayal. The hospital grew still as night deepened, but Donovan remained awake, his mind replaying every sound of that day. He saw the pen, the flash of steel, the roar of fire, and the collapse of lies. He knew then that his path was set. The Bureau might hide behind reforms, but he would not rest until every shadow was burned away. He leaned back, whispering to the empty room as though answering the ghosts of that night. Sometimes the smallest weapon lights the largest war. Moments later, the terminal erupted. The commander's retaliation lit the airport with fire and fury. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It portrays extreme violence, abuse of authority, and the explosive consequences of unchecked aggression. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic overreach, provoke thought on justice and retaliation, and inspire reflection on the importance of accountability, restraint, and human dignity in positions of power.